Hello and welcome to the Grub Street Lodger and Happy New Year. I hope you had a lovely Christmas. I did. I received this lovely shirt. I also received this microphone here. I was going to make this yesterday, but I made a bit of a mistake. I charged up the charging box for the microphones, but not the microphones themselves, because I didn't realise there was a little sticker you had to peel. So I peeled the sticker and I've charged them up, and here I am, and I hope you can hear me well. I started December really raring. I finished this on the 1st of December because I started it just before. It is The Life, Adventures and Piracies of the Famous Captain Singleton by Daniel Defoe. Now, Daniel Defoe is of course most famous for Robinson Crusoe, and in Robinson Crusoe he managed to create the archetypical desert island story and that singular image of the footprint on the beach, and that's probably his most well-known book today. Some of his others have also got well known, but Captain Singleton's not one of them, which is a little unlucky, I think, because Captain Singleton, I think, is probably the best Defoe book I've read. It has a pretty good story. It has some elements of humour, which Defoe isn't always the best at including, and it has only one, but this is big for him, one very rounded and enjoyable character. And normally his characters are a little bit ciphers. What he's good at is reporting things and reporting processes and reporting, interesting things that could be real and as real, and he had this journalist writing style. But he does create this one great character in this book. The great character, unfortunately, is not Bob Singleton, our main character, but still. So Bob Singleton is he's a little fairly well-off toddler in Islington, but he is taken by gypsies. Don't know why gypsies always have this role in stories, but they frequently do, don't they? And his gypsy mother is hanged for her good works, and that's a little example of just the subtle humour that is in this book that you don't always find in a Defoe. And he ends up, through all sorts of reasons, sailing with Portuguese people, and he was very kind about the gypsies. He's not kind about the Portuguese. The Portuguese are stupid and evil and cowardly, and of course no Englishman can't but despise a coward, and he learns all of his bad habits because he hangs around Portuguese people too much, which seems a bit unfair, but there you go. And he goes sailing with the Portuguese people, and he has a Portuguese master. He's essentially a slave. And this master takes his wages and his prize cuts and all this sort of stuff. And so he wants to get away from this master. So when there's a mutiny, he goes for it. But not because he's a terrible mutinous person, but because he's trying to find any excuse to get away from his bad master. And you'd think this is where the pirate starts, but no, this isn't. The mutineers end up stranded on Madagascar, and they wander around Madagascar, and they form a bond. And a big part of the book is all about these men forming these bonds and sharing their money in sort of one kitty, which they'll then divvy out at the end. And there's a lot of trust among the rogues and brigands in this book. And they deal with the natives, and some are friendly and some are not. And again, there's an effort to make these different kinds of people different. And also, they're not just stock cartoon, cannibal-y figures or bad native figures. There's a little bit of distinction and things. It's not perfect. It wouldn't fit today's, it wouldn't fly past today's levels of scrutiny. But for a thing at this time, it's getting there. And they all get on this boat and they all go over to Africa, and then they have to trek across Africa. Now, Africa was not mapped or very well known by Europeans of Defoe's time, and so this is largely made up, including some bits from Travellers' Tales and some bits of reporting and just lots of guessing. And so this group, they mostly try and stick where people aren't, but when they do come across people, again, there's a lot of thought into the different kinds of cultures that might be there. It's not all one homogeneous African mass. And there's an interesting fact that the people who have dealt most with Europeans are going to be the ones most wary and most likely to try and fight, and the ones that haven't are just going to be curious and like, oh, there's a different bunch of people wandering through our land, we'll leave them to it. One of the first groups they meet who has come across Europeans before, and so try and fight them, they fight them back with guns, and they kill the king, and injure the prince, and then they heal the prince. And the prince is so taken with this and so thankful, he and a group of his people sort of carry their gear. So they're not slaves, they don't get sold at the end or anything like that. And in fact, the prince gets a fair amount of characterisation as far as Defoe's concerned. I mean, I'm not trying to excuse this book. It's yeah, you've got an early 18th century writer writing a book, half of which is set in Africa. It's not going to be always the most comfortable of reads on that sense. But it's mostly action and adventure, and they gather a load of gold and elephants' teeth, as they call them. Not from the actual elephants. They find a big elephant graveyard and get all their teeth. They always call them teeth. And they get to the end and they all divvy up their loot. And Bob goes back to England. And this is one of the interesting facts, because Bob hasn't really lived in England most of his life, and he has no home. And so he's essentially rootless, both geographically, but also religiously, morally. He just doesn't have a home. And so he doesn't have any loyalties, and he doesn't have any firm, fixed morals or anything. He spends all his money, and so he ships off with another ship, joins a mutiny on purpose, and becomes a pirate captain. And actually, this is where the swashbuckling goes down. You'd think when they become pirates, there'd be more swashbuckling. But no, this is almost like a merchant's list. The things they're getting, and the things they're selling, and the things they're capturing. And what they're capturing is more beef than booty. It's more about things they can use or things they can easily sell on. And grand hordes of loot aren't really things they can easily sell on. And again, there's a big element of how they will trust each other, and how even though Bob becomes the captain, he becomes the leader. It's a far more democratic process than many other things in the world at this time. And so, yes, they're presumably killing people and frightening people and torturing people and all sorts as pirates, but none of that gets in the book. One of the people they do capture is a doctor who is a Quaker called William, and here is our fun-rounded character. And he talks in a Quakery way, these and nows and that, and he's a pacifist. But he's also incredibly intelligent and very good at plans. And in fact, he's probably the most able pirate of all of them, including Bob. And so he's this sort of pacifist pirate who never quite becomes the captain, but is always there in his ear, giving him plans and things. And so they all go about and they do their pirate things. And the typical ending of a Defoe novel is the main character, who has done bad things in the past, is now rich enough to be able to be good. One of the key, almost leitmotifs of his novels is that you need money to be good, because the lack of it means that you are open to temptation. You're essentially not protected by wealth. That's kind of what happens. And so he gets enough money to be good and to retire and to have a happy life, but he has no roots. So he starts to connect to Christianity, and then he feels terrible about the things he's done in his life, and he wants to kill himself. But William the Quaker again is like, no, come on, you just keep going with me for a bit. And so they end up going disguised in England as Armenians, and Bob ends up marrying William's widowed sister, and they all live happily ever after. And William is just this fun character because he's full of contradictions. He is a pacifist pirate. He's a Quaker swashbuckler. He's coming up with all the most cunning of ruses at the same time that he's espousing all this, be open and kind to people. And it makes him very interesting. He doesn't come across as a hypocrite, just a person full of contradictions, which, it's good. It's really interesting. It's rare for Defoe. I really liked him. And the book itself, as I say, probably one of the best Defoes I've read. So that was the life, adventures and piracies of the famous Captain Singleton. So I thought, you know what? I'm going to continue in an 18th century vein for the rest of December, and I'm going to get a twofer. Here's my twofer. This is The Devil Upon Crutches by Alain-Renée Lesage, translated by Tobias Smollett. So the reason it's a twofer, the original novel, Le Diablo Bouteille, I think, was written by Lesage at the beginning of the 18th century, and it was translated by Tobias Smollett, the author of Roderick Random and Humphrey Clinker and stuff, in the middle of the 18th century. The French book, apparently, was so popular when it came out that at least 2 French people fought a duel over the last copy in a bookshop. It could just be because they're French. I should stop, especially because I've got a mic right there. And this was translated by Tobias Smollett when he was in his hack writer era. He'd written Peregrine Pickle? No, he'd written Roderick Random. He was writing Peregrine Pickle. It was a response to his successful translation of Lesage's Gil Blas, and Smollett was then going to go off and translate Don Quixote. And then he was actually going to marry a rich heiress of a sugar plantation and live it up as a gentleman and occasionally do things in magazines. But yeah, so that's where we are in his life. This is a Grub Street production essentially, but it's a good one, and it's not a great story. It's a collection of interesting anecdotes and sometimes good stories that don't all add up to a big whole. Essentially. So your main character, who's a Spanish man with a very long name ending in Zambulo, he has come out of his lover's window after he's been assigning with her, and a group of ruffians come up and say, you either marry her or we kill you. And he runs away, and he runs up on the roof, and he ends up in this attic full of weird alchemical magical things, and there's a voice calling to him, and the voice is in a bottle. And the voice belongs to the demon Asmodeus, who he frees. And Asmodeus, as a treat, says, well, I'll take you around and let you look at things. Now, Asmodeus isn't one of the big demons. They're not in charge of kings or law. They're in charge of fads and fashions and, I guess, memes. And also silly love matches and silly romantic shenanigans and entanglements. And so a lot of our stories will involve those. But first he takes him up, and he can sort of peel off the roofs of houses so that they can see the people in them. And it goes through a lot of usual 18th century stuff. There's a beau who takes off his wig, he takes off his teeth, he takes off his right hand, he takes off his right leg and sleeps with what's left of him. There's a beautiful belle whose fake buttock once fell off at the altar during mass, and all this sort of stuff. And yeah, there's lots of jokes about cuckolding and servants sleeping with the woman of the house and all this sort of stuff. It's pretty typical fun 18th century, oh look how secretly hypocritical everyone is kind of stuff. And they go down to the prisons, and there's a highwayman who's getting a file out of a loaf of bread, and they follow death around and notice that most people are quite happy at the people who've died because it means they're in for some money. They even go into dreams, but all the dreams are essentially showing the venal nature of humanity, and that's kind of the point, I guess. And it's pretty fun, pretty funny. There are some longer stories in it. They're very complicated love stories, one involving twins and Barbary pirates and being enslaved and all this, and it's all good fun. There's a bit of misogyny in it. There's a story about these 2 men who are great friends, and then Asmodeus says, yeah, that story couldn't happen with women because women can't be friends. There you go. But on the whole, it's a bit of a romp, but it's not a romp that builds to much more than it is. But it was all good. And so now I'd read these 2, and I'm pretty much enjoying it, and I'm flying through, and I hit a roadblock, and the roadblock was The Canterbury Tales by Harriet and Sophia Lee. These are in the Pandora Mothers of the Novel series. Now, Harriet and Sophia Lee created this whole set, mostly Harriet, this whole set of stories that they called the Canterbury Tales. They're not anything to do with the other Canterbury Tales. They're just, the first ones are set in Canterbury. And this is a selection of some of them, including the most famous one, The German's Tale, which was one of Byron's favourite stories. And it was The German's Tale that completely floored me. In fact, out of the 6 stories in here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, yeah. Out of the 6 stories in here, it was only The German's Tale that I found difficult or unpleasant or unenjoyable. But it completely... I just it's like walking into a dead end. It took me longer to read this 160-page short story than it took me to read the whole of the Count of Monte Cristo. And it's because the sentences were really, really long, and the point of them never quite emerged. So you'd read it and you'd be like, what's happening? Is this describing a flashback? Is this happening now? What are they actually saying? And all the sentences talk around their point. They're these paragraph-long sentences that talk around and spiral around their point. And the rest of the stories aren't like that. And in fact, the first one was written by Sophia, and that was quite a fun sort of. It was a love story, and it just crammed in all the tropes, really. So there was secret parentage. There was a very interesting character who was a soldier who'd sort of given up on the human race, and he'd gone off to live with Brahmins in India, and he'd become a vegetarian and stuff. And it was all this. This man at the beginning took this baby that he claimed to be his bastard son, even though he wasn't. I still can't quite get why he did that. But he claimed him to be his bastard son, even though he just basically rescued him from a pond. And he was really concerned about, I've taken this boy from his parents. But in the end, it turned out he hadn't, because the parents one had died and one was off being a soldier. Who was the soldier? Who was the best? And there's all this kind of, that was good fun. And then the other ones, I'll get to the German one, but the other ones, there was one about these two men. One was a cynic and one was an optimist, and the optimist was trying to sort of bring the cynic round. There was quite one that started very funny. It's called The Wives' Tale, and it started off with this 50-year-old man marrying a 16-year-old girl and thinking, my life's starting now because I've got my wealth, I've got my beautiful woman who I can show off, and everything's great. And it was a very funny satire on sort of high society, and basically how she became more, not even corrupted, she just leaned into the glitz and the glamour and just didn't really love her husband, and he got more and more tired of it. Yet the happy ending of it was all brought about due to the death of a baby. So there's that. There was one about a woman who stole a baby, and partially to get back at the man who impregnated her, not telling her he was already married, and she becomes the nurse for his wife when he's not around, steals the baby, long time passes, and he accidentally condemns his son, who he doesn't know is his son, to transportation to Botany Bay, and he dies on the way, and it's a sort of tragedy. But the German tale is the only one not told in first person. No, the first one wasn't in first person, but most of them were in first person. Maybe that was part of it, but it was told in third person in these very long, wiggly sentences. And started off with this family, a man, a wife, and a son, who are very, very poor, but obviously have some history. And as their history is revealed, and as they try and get out of this town without anyone really realising, and there's a man who's after them to imprison them, because if he imprisons them, he gets the claim, and all of this. And then there was a big twist at the end, where the man realises his son wasn't quite the paragon of virtue he thought he was. And the story's good, but the telling was just really, really dreadful. Well, was it dreadful? I found it dreadful. Here's the sentence. Those feelings and perplexities which had been indistinctly expressed by the Count presented themselves meantime at full to the cool judgment of Michele. Oh, that's a really short one. That's probably the shortest sentence in the book. But yeah, I found that very difficult. It took me a very long time. So my big 18th century read in December didn't quite happen because of the German tale. The last book I read was just a little one I picked up for free ages ago. It's called the Rosie-Posie book. And it was just, I wanted to read something sweet and nice. It's a children's book going through this girl's day, morning, going to school, playing, going to bed, but all the time being watched by roses. And that's what made this weird and interesting. So the roses always have a comment on what's happening. And just these weird sentient roses who are following you and looking at you throughout your day. So in supper time it says, and while our bread and milk we take, the roses wait politely. They seem extremely wide awake. How can they feel so sprightly? Ooh, how can they? Ooh, creepy. It's not supposed to be creepy, it's supposed to be sweet. It is sweet, but I like that little element of these roses who are always watching. So that was my December. It wasn't as satisfying a reading month as it could have been. In fact, the whole year I read a lot less than usual. Not just fewer books, but fewer pages. My little Goodreads thing said to me about 1,000 fewer pages than I have for the last few years. A lot of that's to do with the moving and the setting up and the plays and the this and the that. So I hope to be back on form next year. And I've started really well. I'm reading a really good book now, so we'll see. Yeah, so for all that, hopefully you've heard it nice and clearly because of my nice new mic, and see you throughout the rest of the year, I hope.